Welcome to the first in the Gas and LNG Insights podcast series, produced by NGW in partnership with RBAC. RBAC is the market-leading supplier of global and regional gas and LNG market simulation systems. These systems provide industry analysts powerful tools for supporting investment and M&A strategy, environmental and sustainability goals, credible risk analysis, trading strategy, and policy development and assessment. Today, it is great to be joined by RBAC's CEO, Dr. Robert Brooks. Dr. Brooks founded RBAC in 1987 based on experience developing several well-respected predictive models for government and industry. He designed the first gas transportation model while getting his PhD at MIT and has led the industry ever since. The subject today is one that has held many headlines over the past 2 years, at least in the energy sector: Russian natural gas supply, and in particular, the country's LNG trade. Dr. Brooks, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction, and very happy to be here on the first Natural Gas World podcast.
Great to have you here. To get our listeners and viewers all on the same page, let's set the ground. How significant a player is Russia in the LNG market? Around how much does it export, and where do those supplies go?
Well, LNG exports out of Russia have been growing significantly over the past 10, 15 years. It basically started at a facility in Asia and Sakhalin Island with some offshore supplies there, which were made into LNG and primarily delivered to Japan, Korea, and some to China. So it was basically in the East. But in the mid 2010s, so like around 2017 or 2018, a new facility was opened up in the Russian Arctic area in what's called the Yamal Peninsula, which is, if you look at a Russian map, you would see it very far north, almost in the Arctic. And this was really an incredible idea. The first facility and major export capability that was not owned by Gazprom. This was owned by another company, a private company called Novatek. And you can see the growth of LNG exports, which occurred at that particular time. So you're running around, in terms of billions of cubic meters, which is not the same as millions of tons per year, but billions of cubic meters. We were running around 15 BCM out of Sakhalin. And then again in 2018, you saw this ramp up at the Yamal facility, where now you've more than doubled. And in fact, you've got about 25 and even more that is being produced at Yamal. And that has to be delivered over what's called the Northern Sea Route, which is very far north in essentially the Arctic Circle. And it can be delivered either eastward or westward. So it can be delivered westward towards Europe and other parts of the world, or it could be delivered eastward toward Asia. The only problem is that this is an area which is largely iced over in various parts of the calendar, and in fact, the eastward route is actually only open 4 months a year. So when Yamal LNG is destined for Asia during the alternate months, when the eastern route is not open, LNG actually has to flow westward and basically almost all around the globe to get to Asia, which is a problem. So it's an interesting project. It's very low cost LNG. The government has given Yamal Novatek tax breaks to make it very competitive. But it has some real issues as far as delivery to market, just due to its geography.
Mhm. Okay, interesting. I mean, looking at that graph, with the launch of Yamal LNG, you've had a very, big increase very quickly in Russian LNG capacity. Um, in the last 2 years, we've seen the opposite happen with Russian pipeline gas to Europe, which is, of course, Russia's main gas export business by far. So even though that's happened, Russian LNG flow to Europe has remained strong despite the political climate. But there is a risk of further cuts to pipeline gas or LNG or both, whether politically motivated or otherwise. Can you walk me through RBAC's scenarios for if these supplies are cut, the impact on volumes on the European markets, pricing? Walk me through them.
Yes, we have taken a look at this, and you're totally right, Joe. The volumes that have been flowing into Europe from Russia on pipeline have actually declined enormously. And actually, I think we have a chart here that shows the pipeline flows. And these are all exports out of Russia. You can see the blue line is, the orange line is total exports out of Russia, again in billions of cubic meters per year. The blue line is flows into Europe. The green line is flows into Central Asia. And, so this includes, Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan and so forth. And then you can see this gray line starting, just barely starting in 2019 and growing rapidly, but still quite small, which flows into China on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. Now note that this chart, just like the other one, has actual data through 2022 as reported by BP and Energy Institute. 2023 has passed, and so the data is not totally available, but we've used best sources to try to get a correct estimate of what those flows were. And then 2024 and 25 are forecasts from various sources as to how things are going to play out in the future. So you can see more Russian gas on the Power of Siberia 2 going to China, the gray line, basically the same flat as far as CIS. But you can see continued reduction in flows to Europe, primarily across the Ukraine. Russia also has another pathway into Europe, which goes south through the Black Sea, Turkey, and then in Southeast Europe. And there's quite a lot of flow actually into Turkey, which is, at least in some data sources, is considered to be part of Europe. And so that's what we've done here. And but anyway, you can see there's actually a couple of interesting things here. One is that there's a reduction in 2019 to 2020 on the blue line. You can see that. And this is primarily due to a new agreement which took effect in 2020 regarding gas transit across Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine have had problems for many, many years. And so the new transit agreement was quite a bit lower than what the volumes were and the agreement was prior to 2019. Plus you also had the beginning of COVID and so forth in 2020 and 2021. But the major decline, of course, is due to the war between Russia and Ukraine. And you can see that in the data going from 2022 and 2023.
Okay, and if there's a further cut in this pipeline supply or LNG, it remains to be seen regarding LNG whether Russia would take such a step. On an EU level, they've talked about curtailing Russian LNG, or various EU member states have talked about it individually. What would be the impact on the European market, which has seen unprecedented volatility over the past 2 years already?
Well, I think it might be a little bit surprising. I think we have a chart here that shows a scenario that we have run using our model, which looks at what would the price be at the major pricing point in Europe, which is called TTF. And this is in the Netherlands, so it's in far Western Europe. But it's indicative, and it is the really the major trading hub for natural gas in Europe at this point. Now you can see that when you go from 2025 down to 26, 27, 28, prices are coming down a lot in all different scenarios. And I think this is largely due to two factors. Number one is that you do have a reduction in demand or consumption of natural gas in Europe, which has been part of governmental policy as far as the energy transition is concerned. But it also is an indication that the people of Europe are willing to conserve energy, in times of crisis. So they showed that over the last couple of winters, and energy demand, went down, substantially. You do get a price effect here going on as far as electricity is concerned, because electricity prices are up. And so that's another effect on conservation. But anyway, regarding the specific point, if you look at three scenarios, the first one is sort of the base case. And these colors, unfortunately, they don't differentiate that well. But the base case, as you can see, is the highest price. And then, is the lowest price.
Yeah,
and then you can see if you keep Russian LNG from flowing into Europe, then you get a price impact, which is the middle point. And then if you also reduce the pipeline gas through Ukraine, down to zero, so that at the end of 2024, which is when the contract expires, the current contract expires, if Russia and Ukraine decide together that they can't make a new deal, and therefore they're going to cut off the remaining gas that's flowing through Ukraine, then you would get the one that's the highest price impact. But I think the main thing to point out is that if you look at the spread between these, it's not very high. So there is some price impact. In 2025, you get like maybe almost $1 or 75 cents US per million BTU impact. But over time, it gets smaller and smaller as demand in Europe declines. Now, all the prices kind of rise in the longer run, I think, as supplies are harder to get at low prices, but still the spread is relatively minor. So, I think there's implications for this. Number one is, first of all, I think, Europe has proven, that it can adjust its market behavior under circumstances that are really very tough. You went from a situation where Russia was delivering over 200 BCM per year of gas into Europe to a situation where, it's down to, quite a bit less than that, less than 100, even counting the flows into Turkey and so forth. So it has, and it will go even lower than that. So they've been, I think, very good about that. But you have to ask the question, well, what's going to happen to all of that Russian gas? Because, Russia is still the largest resource base of natural gas in the world is in Russia. But Russia is also a huge country, as we know. It's 10 or 11 time zones. It's like incredible. So the point is that, some of these resources are hard to get to market. They're very remote. And even though they've proven that they can do this from the Arctic Circle area around Yamal area, Yamal, Nenetsk, and have done this for quite a long time. That primarily has been the market that they are primarily aiming at during that entire time has been Europe. Now, if that market is removed, you have to ask the question, well, where is it going to go? Where can that gas go, and what does the future for Russia look like? Now, everyone always points out China because China is still the most populous country in the world. Maybe India is they're about neck and neck at this point. But it has a much larger economy than India at this point. So there's a huge economy, a huge population base, and a huge requirement for energy in China. Now, Russia has a long border with China, and China, even though it does very well in the sense that it produces about 60% of the gas that it ends up consuming, still it needs that other 40%. And that other 40% either has to come by pipeline or has to come by LNG. So it's a natural market, but it's hard to imagine other sort of natural markets that Russia could aim for. It's also contiguous with Central Asia, but Central Asia has plenty of gas supply itself. So it doesn't really need it. And I think, India is a market that is too far removed from Russia directly by pipeline. So, it is a market for LNG, but it's quite a distance from it. So anyway, the point is that, Russia is in kind of a difficult situation here when it looks at longer term gas strategy. A few years ago, it publicly, I think, President Putin, announced, and his ministers announced that they wanted to become a major global player in LNG, competing against the United States and Qatar and so forth, and maybe 100 million tons per year. Well, it's really hard to see how they're going to do this without, a strong European market, and the fact that the supplies that they have for conversion into LNG are located so far away from market. And, just to go on just a little bit more, I mean, we've seen this with the next Novatech project up in the Arctic, which is called Arctic 2 LNG, which is supposed to be starting up this month, actually. I think their first cargo is supposed to occur either this month or soon. But because of sanctions and so forth, a lot of their partners in terms of engineering and construction and offtake have decided to declare force majeure, and because of the war and sanctions. And so those technologies and those markets are no longer available to them. So it's unclear whether Arctic 2 LNG, which is supposed to be like 20 million ton capacity facility, whether it's going to actually be able to operate anywhere near, 100% capacity. Maybe it could get up to 30 or 40 or 50%, but it has the same issues that Yamal has in terms of distance from market and difficulty to actually move, tankers to those markets. So Russia's found itself in a very interesting situation, but a very difficult one. Personally, I think that, there's a lot of negotiation around or discussion around a new pipeline and negotiations called Power of Siberia 2, which would actually bring natural gas by pipeline to China through Mongolia. And the source of the supply would be the Yamal-Donetsk area. So it would be a very, very long pipeline. And, I think that, it would be significant. It's like a 50 BCM capacity pipeline. So it's very significant pipeline. But, I think the Chinese are in a better negotiating position, honestly, than the Russians here, because, China has set itself up where it has a lot of import capacity for LNG. And it also has a lot of actually even potentially greater alternative source of natural gas by pipeline through Turkmenistan, which has some of the largest reserves on the planet in that small country. Expansion of the Central Asia-China pipeline system. So there's a lot of alternatives that China has, a lot of options, and Russia doesn't have too many. It's basically China and domestic. Now that's another thing too. I think you and I had a little conversation about this, that there is some discussion in Russia, which I think is very appropriate, to use more of the natural gas developing their own economy, and perhaps doing coal gas power conversions and various other kinds of things, because they have the gas supply. These fields have already been developed up and their potential is still great. So, using them on their own behalf, even though that doesn't bring in a foreign, capital, still it could be really good for Russia's own industrial development.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of interesting points to pick up there. Yeah, so I agree that Russia has found itself in a very precarious situation, having lost most of its market share in Europe. It's trying to find new avenues for its gas supply wherever it can, really. Trying to send some to, as you mentioned, Central Asia, but these are very small markets, or relatively, their import needs are relatively small. Using more gas domestically, sending more gas to Turkey, but again, this doesn't go anywhere near replacing, making up for the huge loss in Europe. And as you mentioned, China, one option, long-term option, and you have LNG. I think the issue with China is that some people might remember that it took a very long time to reach a first gas deal. They finally reached one in 2014 for Russian gas supply to China via Power of Siberia, and that was at least a decade in discussion, and it could take quite some time for another deal to be reached. As you mentioned, China is in a better negotiating position, and it might want to hold out for a better deal for longer than Russia would want. So that's very interesting. Okay, so one thing that Russia has set as well for quite a few years now, it's set itself as a strategic priority is the development of the Northern Sea Route, for gas, for oil, for various other commodities, taking advantage of global warming, which has reduced the amount of thick ice up there in the Arctic. What do you think this? What do you think the increased use of the Northern Sea Route in terms of a longer navigation season? What kind of impact would that have on Russian LNG?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, and we're not going to know the results for a while here, but this is something that has been planned, I think, or at least hoped, and planning has gone into trying to make the Northern Sea Route more accessible to Russian shipping, not just LNG, but as you said, oil, but also other things too, minerals and materials and so forth and so on. And it's hard for us in the United States to really understand this, because we have actually relatively temperate weather compared to, and we don't have that kind of issue, except maybe in northern Alaska, where you have the icing conditions, which make sea-bound traffic impossible during certain parts of the year. But as I mentioned, I think before, maybe I haven't, the Northern Sea Route going on the eastward direction towards Asia. I mean, the reason why it seems like it's great if you look at a globe, because it cuts down the amount of distance that a tanker would have to travel to get to Asia enormously for Russia. I mean, it is, way, way better. The only trouble is, as you point out, you have thick sea ice. And only 4 months out of the year is it open on average. Now, some years it's 5, some years it's less, and so forth. But on average, I think it's about 4 months out of the year. Well, that's only a third of the year. So, even though you might have a huge capacity, most of the time you're going to have to send it westward rather than eastward, out of Yamal and out of Arctic 2 LNG. So, Russia has been investing in, it has some of the best icebreakers in the world, nuclear icebreaking vessels. And my understanding is that they're investing in more and investing in that technology to be able to open to a greater, for a greater length of time, the Northern Sea Route going eastward out of the Yamal Peninsula and that area more of the year. Now, I don't know if they know, if anybody knows, what the potential is there, but I have seen stories where, the nuclear icebreakers kind of lead the way. They're kind of the leader of the pack, and they get a whole bunch of ships following them. And that could include LNG, but it could be oil or other, kinds of ships, as I said. And they follow them, on that pathward eastward to, out through the Bering Sea, and ultimately, to markets in China and other markets in Asia. So, I have done an analysis, assuming, I think, a really optimistic scenario. But the optimistic scenario would be that, further development of those nuclear icebreakers, plus whatever happens naturally, opens up the Northern Sea Route going eastward over a period of time, so that by 2030, so basically in 6 years or 6.5 years, it's essentially open 12 months a year. So it's essentially open all the time. And so actually, I think we've got a chart here, which shows the difference in LNG deliveries from Russia to China under those two scenarios. So you can see the blue line is sort of the normal, if you will. This is traffic that is moving during those 4 months over to Asia, plus any traffic that is going westward on the Northern Sea Route and then going most of the way around the world to Asia, which, there's a fair amount of traffic that goes that way. But you can see then, if you also assume that you're starting to open up the Northern Sea Route, the red line, you can see it more than doubles the amount of LNG which would flow that direction. Well, of course, if that direction is available, you wouldn't use the westbound route anymore. You would only use the eastbound route to get to China. So a lot of the contracts that exist right now, China and Japan both invest in Arctic 2 LNG and Yamal. So they would be getting their LNG, more quickly and in greater volume using that Northern Sea Route. So, I mean, there's some real potential there, which would be overall to Russia's benefit. However, I don't show it in a chart here, but one thing that was sort of interesting to me, the overall sum of all Russian LNG flows does not actually increase very much. Okay, so it's more a displacement of movements that would be occurring westbound towards Europe, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and so forth. Those are being displaced to go directly to Asia.
Mhm.
And so that's all very interesting. There's another little interesting thing, if we've got time here, I would say, you know, it's a very smart thing that that the Russians and Novatek have done, which is that they realize that, you know, right now and over the past few years, they have had to deliver LNG that was bound for China during the off months when the Northern Sea Route was frozen going eastward. They've had to deliver LNG to places in Europe, in Northwest Europe, and then to reload that LNG on other tankers and head south, you know, through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, and then down from the Suez Canal over to Asia. So again, it's very costly and time-consuming to go that particular route, but you also have to go through Europe to do that. So they have this other idea, which is to build a reloading capability within Russian territory. And so they actually have something that has been put into place, and I'm not sure it's totally operational yet, but it's supposed to be operational soon, if not already, offshore Murmansk. So this is in the far western reach of northern Russia, Murmansk, before it you know, before it goes into the Scandinavian countries. I think it's Norway, and you know, it will be able. Essentially, it does two things. Number one is it brings the whole traffic under its own control, because you can take that westbound LNG, reload it into regular tankers, and send it anywhere in the world. But besides that, remember that, and I didn't mention this before, but out of Sabeta, which is the port that is used for Russian LNG out of Yamal, they have to use specialized tankers, because even though, you know, the ice is passable, there's still ice. So they have to use a special kind of LNG tanker called an ARC-7. And it's it's much more expensive than a regular tanker. And so moving an ARC-7 all the way around the world, I've heard that they've gone all the way to Europe, all the way to India, is really, you know, not the way to go. But also moving it to Northwest Europe and then having to go back, you know, to Yamal is not very efficient. But if you only have to take it to Murmansk and then go back and put a regular tanker from Murmansk to your markets, then that is much more efficient use of those ARC-7 specialized tankers. The same thing is true on the eastbound path, where they're setting up something that's quite similar off the coast of the Kamchatka Peninsula.
Kamchatka.
Yeah. And so that would be the same thing. Instead of having to take an ARC-7 during those 4 or 5 months or 6 months or whatever, instead of having it take it all the way to China or Japan or Korea, what you can do is only take it to Kamchatka and send it back home empty, and then take a regular tanker from Kamchatka to the market. So that's a more efficient use of their resources and will keep costs down as well. So I think those are great ideas. And I think Novatek and Russia, you know, are, you know, certainly, you know, should be admired for their, intelligence and how they're able to actually work with this natural gas in the northern, you know, Arctic areas and convert it to LNG and move it efficiently around the world. It's just the geopolitical issues that have made things tough.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Brooks, for your insight. To finish off, I'd just like to kind of get your kind of summary view of the outlook for Russian LNG. I mean, in your last graph, you didn't see much growth potential in the actual export levels. It was more about where the LNG is going. You know, train 1 of Arctic LNG 2 should be shipping out cargoes this month. A lot greater uncertainty about its second and third cargoes. Novatek has a string of other projects in the works, and there's the gas reserves are there to underpin them, but because of the sanctions, because of the lack of technology, it's a very difficult it's a very difficult subject to really know what to expect from. But what's kind of your summary projection for the, what does fate have in store for Russian LNG?
Well, one thing that I've learned in doing these kind of simulations and analysis, and perhaps also one reason why we don't see, if the Northern Sea route eastbound is opened up, that we just get a shift in Russian LNG instead of a major increase, is that again, it's still, out of the Arctic, it's still pretty marginal and pretty inexpensive, or pretty expensive compared to alternatives. The other problem that Russia has is that other alternatives are being built up at the same time that it wants to build up its capacity.
Right.
So it's not, that they're the only game in town. And, the United States, of course, has so much natural gas potential, and in its sort of a different structure for the market, has managed to move into first place on LNG exports after only 7 years of I mean, Sabine Pass only started up in 2016. But there's even way more projects that are planned for the United States that may or may not happen. At the same time, Qatar is expanding its capacity from 77 million tons a year to 126 million tons a year. I mean, that's a lot. That's almost 50 million tons additional capacity. And they are geographically, in a really good position. Plus, it's really cheap gas. So they're in a really good position. And then we have, of course, Mozambique and Tanzania. Mozambique much farther along, but also potentially LNG projects out of both Mozambique and Tanzania in the southeast part of Africa, which are exceedingly well positioned to deliver LNG to India, where natural gas demand is growing enormously. Not to mention Pakistan and Bangladesh, where it's also very strong. So, there's, the tides are coming in there. Whatever the right terminology is here, as far as Russia is concerned. Greater and greater competition at the same time that they would like to develop their own resource base and make it available to the world. In the end, I think it's if a resolution to the situation in Ukraine can be come about soon, I think that's better for everybody, not just Ukraine and Russia, the rest of the world. But I think particularly for Russia, actually, because geopolitical factors such as that, are really strong impediments to making progress in the world economy. There's other things that are going on right now that are also big impediments, as we know, in the Middle East, and there are groups that are trying to make it sort of business as usual difficult or impossible. Most LNG right now is not going to flow through the Suez Canal because it has to go through the Red Sea. And cargoes have already been attacked in the Red Sea, as we know, in the southern part of the Red Sea. So this means that those cargoes are going around Africa, which is a much longer route rather than going through the Suez Canal. The other thing I think that's really important, and one reason why you see what we see in our models, is that when you look at, basically the way that these models work is that if a contract is in place, a supply contract, and SPA is actually in force and has been achieved, then almost undoubtedly most of that or all of that is going to flow in the model. And in the real world, it's going to flow. Sometimes these are not really economic in some regard if you look at it from a marginal cost basis. it doesn't seem like it's economic, but somehow or other, the two parties have come together. They've made an agreement. And once that agreement is in place, it's really solid. So if we, as far as Russia is concerned, if you could see more parties actually committing to offtake agreements, from Yamal LNG 2 or from Baltic LNG, or, I think Yamal is totally sold out, but these other places, then, then our model results would change. But we don't see those contracts yet. So, we see a certain volume, but essentially when you start competing outside of the contract volumes that have already been committed to, and you're looking at spot LNG, currently Russia is not in very good position. So it's just a matter of the reason why, we don't get more Russian LNG flowing is because the contract volumes haven't changed in those different scenarios. It's just that if the Northern Sea route was opened all year round, it would be more efficient. And so, they could take the more efficient routes to Asia rather than the less efficient route. And so that's what we see happening. But, I think these are the learnings that we've had over many years of doing these kinds of analysis. And our idea is that, we have been providing tools to people in academia, to government, to industry for many, many years now. At RBAC now for more than 25 years. Most of our work has gone into North America, but the last several years, we have put into building out our capability on global gas and LNG. And our purpose is to provide the tools that enable these organizations to make better decisions in one way or another. Policymakers in government make better decisions, and investment decisions in private industry regarding, whether, they should do this thing or that thing, or, where they should invest their money or whatever. Those are the reasons why, they are currently or might be interested in the kind of software databases and products that, that RBAC has to offer them. So in the end, we think that the LNG market is a very, LNG is very good. We know we run up against a certain subset of the environmental movement, which thinks that LNG and natural gas are bad for the world. We don't think that. We think that they are very good, that they can, that LNG and natural gas can be very useful in helping countries to develop their economies where their economies are very poor at this point, like in, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa, certain parts of Asia and South America and the Middle East. There's a lot of opportunity. There's also a lot of opportunity to switch out gas for coal in generation of electricity in various parts of the world. It's already happened a lot in the United States, and it could happen elsewhere. That's another point that, for Russia, for example, they have a lot of their electricity is produced by coal. It could be produced by natural gas. So that's a way that they could probably invest in something that's going to clean their air to a greater degree. As to the whole greenhouse gas issue, I think that there are sort of points in either direction, but I think natural gas comes out ahead of coal, very substantially in the end. But none of that is going to happen, as far as development of the economies or the role of natural gas and LNG in developing new, better economies in Africa and Asia and elsewhere, if LNG is too expensive. So this means that it is, I think, the challenge for the global natural gas industry and for global LNG industry is to keep costs as low as possible. And if you can do that, if you can make it affordable, then these countries are going to use it. But if you can't make it affordable, they're not going to switch. They're going to go for cheaper coal than they are going to go for LNG. And this is for sure. And they're telling us that. I mean, whether it's at the WEF or EIA or any of these global, it's very simple. They're not going to do it, and they're not going to do any of this green stuff if it means that it's going to keep them from developing their economy. Their local economies are going to come first. And so LNG has a role to play there. RBAC's contribution in that is to provide tools that enable governments and industries to review the possibilities and to come up with strategies and policies that are going to actually be economical, that are going to keep LNG and natural gas cheap enough so that these countries will actually utilize it to a greater degree and enhance the energy transition in that regard, but also help with global economic development where it's most needed. So those are from our purpose point of view. That's what RBAC's purpose has been. Besides the obvious purpose of building our business and getting more customers and so forth. But beyond that, we do have a more global type purpose because we do believe LNG and natural gas have a very important role to play in the world and in economic development.
Well, I think it's very interesting work you're doing, and thanks once again for joining me in this discussion.
Well, thank you, Joe. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak on behalf of Natural Gas World. We've developed a budding partnership here, and I hope that we find many different ways that we can, work together to, again, achieve the goals that I'm sure that Natural Gas World, has kind of similar goals to what RBAC has. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist at all. So, together, I'm hoping that we can reach to more people and have a positive effect on the industry and on the world. So thank you very much.
Certainly. This has been the first in the Gas and LNG Insights podcast series produced by NGW in partnership with RBAC. Thank you for tuning in, everyone, and see you next time.